I have been reading. I just got back from Colorado yesterday, and was reading on the plane the new book by Alistair McGrath called "The Dawkins Delusion," in response to Richard Dawkins's book, "The God Delusion." And by the way, there are three responses to that book that have the word delusion in it. This one, Dawkins Delusion, Dawkins Dangerous Delusion, and I don't know, the Deluded Delusion or something like that. There are just all these delusion books coming out in response to Dawkins's book. And I noticed on one of the pages here, halfway through the book, McGrath cites Dawkins' objection about taking the Bible literally. So a big part of what Dawkins' attack on religion entails not only the promotion of science as kind of ending the discussion about religion and the existence of God, but also then focusing in on religion and seeing how bad it is. And he notes here, McGrath does, that Dawkins insists that to take the Bible seriously is to, and here now he's quoting Dawkins, strictly observe the Sabbath and think it is just and proper to execute anyone who chose not to, and also to execute disobedient children. Close quote. Now, of course, these are things part of the Old Testament law, and if you take the Bible literally, then that means you must apply all aspects of the Old Testament law, and if you're not applying it now, then obviously you don't take it literally. Now, you don't apply this now, therefore you don't take it literally, therefore you don't really take it seriously, and it's just a bunch of nonsense like Dawkins says it is. And this is actually similar to what we talked about last week when my niece Kirsten had sent a question, "Hey, Uncle Greg," regarding her friend who is challenging her about taking the Bible literally. And I actually gave you only half of that interchange, mine with her, in response to Pete's challenge and question. And I thought, well, in light of this piece that I just read in McGrath's book on Dawkins, and Dawkins' own kind of challenge here, since this really amounted to the second half of my discussion with Kirsten, I thought I'd just kind of bring you up to date and add the second half of that discussion. If you recall, the first part of the discussion from last week was, what was Jesus' take on homosexuality? Did he say anything about it? And I gave an answer to that. And you can refer back to last week's podcast or to the YouTube, the visual, the tape that we did of that to get my answer to that. And I also, if you recall, I had a couple of other questions for Pete before I even got into my response. One of them was, well, what if Jesus weighed in against homosexuality? Would that change your view? And there were some others as well. And again, like I said, you can refer back to that week if you want. But here is what, after sending the response that I shared with you last week, Kirsten received this response back from Pete. And now I'm quoting from the email. "The Old Testament is part of the Bible. You've said that the Bible is God's Word, that we should take it literally." Now, this is what she said to him. And if you recall from last week, I warned you against saying that because the statement, "we take the Bible literally," is wildly ambiguous, too easy to be misunderstood. And I suggested rather that you say, "we take the Bible at face value." In other words, you read metaphors as metaphors, other figures of speech as figures of speech, and those things which we seem to be factual statements about reality as factual statements about reality if we have no good reason, given the context, to take it differently. This is the way you read anything in literature. It's the way you read the sports page. And so a counter question might be, do you take the sports page literally? And the response, of course, is, well, that depends. If you're reading scores, factual information, yes. If it says, one team devoured another, you realize that cannibalism's not going on there. So you realize it's a figure of speech that is meant to communicate a literal idea, which you distill from the figures of speech quite easily. And you read the Bible just like you read anything else, for the most part. There's some exceptions with apocalyptic literature in the book of Revelation and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I think that's the response that it should be. And anyway, she said, I take the Bible literally, so he picks up on this. And he offers the response, a rejoinder, to my first answer of his question that I offered last week. He says, you said we should take the Bible literally, and if the Bible is God's true and infallible word, as she claims, should we follow it strictly and literally? And if you exempt the Old Testament from being God's word, thus it would then be thus infallible. I think what he means there, if you exempt it from being God's word, and therefore you're saying that it's fallible, then that is what he says. Then you're admitting that the Bible is in fact fallible and subject to interpretation. By the way, just make a note here that he is equating fallibility with being subject to interpretation. He continues, putting homosexuals to death as mandated in the Old Testament doesn't mean we shouldn't take the Bible literally, but it does mean that if you do take the Bible literally, then morally you should advocate in favor of the death penalty for homosexuals. And if someone's unwilling to do that, then they are either hypocritical or they're opening the Bible up for interpretation. Now, none of us really take the Bible to be completely literal. And so now he's saying, obviously, he's right on this. That's a problem. So it just points out that nobody really takes the Bible literally. There are just varying degrees of interpretation because Jesus said he was a shepherd. He was not. And we are his sheep. I, for one, am not a sheep. Also, if we are to take everything completely literally, why did Jesus talk so much about mustard seeds and women at wells and things like that? Well, he actually talked about the woman at the well because there was a woman at the well that he was talking with, but he's confused there. In any event, he says, I have personally no use for advice on mustard seeds. And then he extends his question again. Have you found anything, Jesus said, about homosexuality? Now, this is the response that he gave to the comments that I offered last week, and Kirsten simply advances them to me and then says, help. How do you respond? And I told her that my point in my last email was that Jesus supported the whole law for the circumstances it was meant to cover. That is, the Jews under the theocracy. But then I went on to respond more precisely to Pete's challenge. And what I needed to do, since all of this was about, taking the Bible literally, and it was the same objection that Richard Dawkins raises, when he says if you take it literally, then you have to execute people that don't keep the Sabbath, and you've got to execute disobedient children. So I thought, well, let's figure out what literally means. And I know what it means, but since there was confusion on this apparently, I went back to the dictionary. What is the New Oxford American Dictionary defined literal as? Taking words in their usual and most basic sense without metaphor or allegory, free from exaggeration or distortion. Okay? In other words, you don't take metaphors literally because they're figure of speech. Same thing of allegory. You don't exaggerate or distort. If you're taking it literally, you take it in its most basic, straightforward sense. Kind of like what I said a few moments ago when I said the way to read the Bible is to take it at face value. And so this is the sense of literal that I think is the operative sense that ought to be employed in these kinds of discussions. Now, to take the Levitical law literally means that the words of the Mosaic law are to be understood in their ordinary sense. There's no metaphors, no allegory. And this is the case, by the way, that the way that we read any legal code. We understand it literally. However, we only apply that legal code to those under the jurisdiction of that legal code. And this is the blunder, I think, that both Pete and Richard Dawkins are making when they're talking about the idea of taking the Bible literally. Yes, there was a legal code for the Jews, and the Jews took it literally at face value because laws are written that way, but that doesn't mean that it applies the same way to us as Christians, even though we understand those laws under that set of circumstances to be understood in a literal sense. So the question we face as Christians is not whether or not those directions are to be taken literally, and clearly they were taken that way by the Jews under the law, but rather whether we are now under that same legal code.